During his violent rule, Assyria recovered much of the territory that it had lost over the period of the Bronze Age collapse. He had grown his kingdom into an empire that was all but unmatched in the region, and he must have looked ahead to the dawning of a golden age for Assyria. But the fortunes of Assyria would soon change for good, with the reign of a king named Adad-nirari II. Adad-nirari was crowned in the year 910 BC, nearly 3,000 years ago, and it's worth mentioning that his reign is perhaps the first event in the entirety of Near Eastern history that can be dated to an exact year with 100% confidence. The Assyrians, like the peoples before them, didn't keep track of years with numbers like we do. Instead, they gave each year a name, sometimes named after a particular person as a kind of honor, or named after a significant event that had taken place, like a great battle or an eclipse of the sun. Assyrian scribes kept long, meticulous lists of these year names, along with brief notes about important events that had taken place, as the following example shows, corresponding to 3 years at the end of the 8th century BC.
The year of Chamberlain Tab-shar-assur, the city of Dua-Sharukin was founded. The year of Shamash-upahir, governor of Haburi, Kumuhi was conquered and a governor was appointed. The year of Shah-assur-dabu, governor of Tushan. The king returned from Babylon, the vizier and nobles. The loot of Dua-Jakin was destroyed on the 22nd of Teshrit. The gods of Dua-Sharukin entered the temples.
This system worked well enough for people of the time, but it means that if a modern historian wants to work out the date of a particular event, they need to have an unbroken list of year names, and for that list to include a known historical event, or an astronomical event that can be clearly dated, like a solar eclipse. Luckily for us, the Assyrians were obsessed with eclipses, believing them to be important omens from the gods, and they kept incredibly careful note of any that occurred. And the reign of Adad-nirari is the beginning of the earliest one of these lists. He was an ambitious king, and he soon began to expand in all directions, into what is today Turkey, Iran, and the Mediterranean coast, drawing on the strength of the formidable Assyrian army. The life of an Assyrian soldier was a tough one. Adad-nirari's armies were made up primarily of men drawn from the fields. They would spend much of their year working on farmsteads with their families, digging canals and turning the dusty earth with ploughs and hand tools, growing beans and pulses, wheat and barley, raising livestock like sheep, pigs and cattle. And then, when the spring came, the rains stopped, and the winter mud hardened across the land, they would be gathered up, given a spear and a shield made of woven reeds, and marched up into the rocky hills or out into the barren desert to fight for the empire. Sometimes they would fight other settled societies who lived in walled towns. Other times, their opponents would be nomadic tribesmen, or even other Assyrians who had rebelled. It must have been a confusing and frightening experience for these men, and no doubt many despised being forced into this service, but perhaps there were also those who enjoyed it. Without these annual excursions, many of them may never have seen a mountain or an ocean, or anything of the world outside their town or village. And since the Assyrian army tended to win more than it lost, there must have been a certain sense of pride in their shared accomplishments. This rhythm, of a season of harvest in the autumn and a season of war in the spring, formed the heartbeat of the Assyrian Empire. It was a drumbeat of expansion and conquest that was continued by the king who came to the throne in the year 883 BC, and who would carry the Assyrian Empire to new and unprecedented heights. His name was Ashurnasirpal II. Ashurnasirpal was a remorseless and ruthless warrior, and many of the things we associate today with the kings of Assyria, their cruelty and harsh treatment of enemies, reached a climax under his rule. Much like many rulers of this time around the world, it's clear that he used terror tactics and tortuous methods of execution to drive fear into the hearts of his enemies. But his inscriptions, out of all those of the kings of Assyria, do stand out for the delight they seem to take in the details of these terror tactics. After crushing one rebellion to his rule, Ashurnasirpal commissioned this inscription describing what happened next.
I burnt many captives from them. I captured many troops alive. From some I cut off their arms and hands. From others I cut off their noses, ears, and extremities. I gouged out the eyes of many troops. I made one pile of the living, and one of heads. I hung their heads on trees around the city. I burnt their adolescent boys and girls. I razed, destroyed, burnt, and consumed the city.
Whether because of these tactics or despite them, in the short term Ashurnasirpal was an effective conqueror. New conquests were turned into client states and ordered to pay tribute to the Assyrian Empire. Enormous wealth began to flow once again into the imperial center, and Ashurnasirpal celebrated his victories with the construction of even more grand palaces.
I founded a palace of cedar, cypress, juniper, boxwood, terebinth, and tamarisk as my royal residence, and for my lordly leisure, for eternity. I made sculptures of beasts of the mountains and the seas, in white limestone and alabaster, and placed them at its doors. I decorated it in a splendid fashion. I hung doors of cedar and cypress in its doorways, and put therein silver, gold, tin, bronze, and iron, treasure from the lands I conquered. I took people which I had conquered from the lands over which I had gained domination, and settled them there.
This policy of resettling conquered people in Assyria wasn't new, but Ashurnasirpal seems to have employed it far more frequently than his predecessors. The Assyrians understood a very simple calculation in the ancient world, that population size meant power, and they quite happily filled their cities with people from all corners of their empire. They created what must have been some of the most cosmopolitan urban environments before the modern age, and we can only imagine what it must have been like for these conquered peoples to be uprooted from their villages and deposited unceremoniously in the vast metropolitan cities of the Assyrian heartland, larger than any town they had ever seen, and where hundreds of languages would have been heard on the streets. But the Assyrians also used deportations and relocations in a much more punitive way, and this policy also reached its height under Ashurnasirpal. Deportation may sound like something of a light punishment when compared to the fates of some of those who stood in the way of the kings of Assyria, but it was a brutally effective tactic for crushing resistance to the empire. Human beings during this time, and throughout history, are so connected to our landscape that this kind of uprooting had a devastating psychological impact on the peoples it was done to. This technique of mass deportations was so effective that it has been employed by modern dictators. Joseph Stalin famously deported at least 6 million people in the 20th century from more than 20 ethnic minority groups considered to be troublemakers. And in the early days of the American colonies, when indigenous people were taken as slaves, they were always transported to another region to break their relationship with the land and reduce their chance of escaping. Whether despite this cruelty or because of it, King Ashurnasirpal did manage to keep the empire together and dramatically expanded it. But he was followed by his son, a man named Shalmaneser III, who would not be so capable. Shalmaneser enthusiastically continued his father's policies of aggressive expansion and mass deportation. But in the final years of his reign, the people of Assyria had had enough. An enormous rebellion led by his son broke out across the entire empire. 27 cities, including the city of Ashur, rose up in rebellion. And this long and bitter civil war allowed virtually all of the people that Ashurnasirpal had conquered to shake off Assyrian rule. Assyria's heavy-handed military domination of the region had made them hated, and it was clear that if they hoped to ever build a lasting empire, something would have to change. One king named Tiglath-Pileser III thought he knew what that thing was, and it was not a softer and more diplomatic approach. He decided, in characteristic Assyrian fashion, that what the empire needed was a much more powerful army. Up until the middle of the 8th century BC, the Assyrian army was much the same as any other force in the region, only a good deal larger, and the numbers really are staggering for the time. Shalmaneser III, the son of Ashurnasirpal, once boasted a force of 120,000 men at a time when the world population has been estimated at only 50 million. If his inscriptions are to be believed, then at that time around 0.25%, or 1 in every 400 of the world's entire population, was at that time serving in the Assyrian army. But it was still a force made up of virtually untrained peasants. The only professional soldiers were bodyguards that protected the king and other nobles, but these were mostly deployed in the cities and palaces, and rarely saw battle. The vast bulk of the Assyrian army was made up of farmers, who, as we've seen, were plucked from their lands whenever the need arose, following the heartbeat of the seasons. Although the empire could summon a vast horde of soldiers, it was an ineffective force. When the autumn came around and the barley grew golden in the fields, these armies of farmers had to march right back home and bring in the crops. Otherwise, the people of the empire would go hungry. Gathering this huge army from the fields was an immensely time-consuming and difficult task. Rebellions could break out at any time of year, but if one occurred in some far corner of the empire, the Assyrians had to wait until summer for their campaign to begin. It would take months to gather all the soldiers required, and then another month or two to march across the region to face it. By the time they arrived, it would be nearly time for the annual harvest, and the men would have to march all the way back home. If they were clever, a rebellious city could simply lock its gates and wait behind their walls for the armies of Assyria to go away, and in many cases this is exactly what they did. But in the year 745 BC, the king Tiglath-Pileser came to the throne. He chose his royal name after the king who had brought Assyria to such greatness more than 3 centuries before, who had forged a path to the Mediterranean and killed that sea creature known as a Nahiru. And this new king, Tiglath-Pileser, engaged in a radical program of reforming the Assyrian military into perhaps the first truly modern army. He reformed the core of the military into a body of elite armored troops, cavalry and chariots, and he demanded that conquered territories on the edges of the empire supplied all of the army's light infantry, who were considered expendable and often bore the brunt of the casualties. The Assyrian army also pioneered the use of a large engineering component to its fighting force. Assyrian soldiers could build bridges and dig tunnels, construct fortifications and siege engines, as well as maintain the supply lines needed to keep an army going. This combined fighting force of soldiers and engineers was similar to the formula that would make the Roman military so formidable 7 centuries in the future. Assyrian carvings show remarkably detailed scenes of the army crossing one of the land's great rivers, something they must have had to do multiple times a year. We see Assyrian men blowing into tied-up sheepskins to inflate them and use as buoyancy aids. Chariots dismantled and turned into boats, rafts constructed to transport supplies and equipment. Army engineers could even cut paths through the treacherous mountains, as this inscription, written by the late Assyrian king Sargon II, seems particularly proud of.
Mount Cimmeria is a great mountain peak that points upward like the blade of a spear. Its summit touches the sky above, and its roots are made to reach down below into the netherworld. It is not fit for the ascent of chariotry or for allowing horses, and its access is very difficult for even the passage of foot soldiers. I had my vanguard carry strong copper axes. They cut through the high mountain crags as if they were limestone, and thereby improved the path. I took the lead of my army and made the chariotry, cavalry, and battle troops fly over the mountain as if they were brave eagles. I had the common soldiers and light infantry follow behind them. The camels and donkeys bearing the baggage leapt up its peaks like the ibexes native to the mountains. I had the numerous troops of the god Asher ascend its difficult slopes in a good order, and then I set up camp on top of that mountain.
Tiglath-Pileser also increased production of iron in the empire. It was a small-scale industrial revolution. Assyrian cities of this time must have become increasingly smoke-filled, the furnaces belching charcoal smoke, the sound of billows and clanging hammers echoing off the buildings. The use of iron allowed the Assyrians to enter the era of true mass production. Assyrians could now use iron to make arrowheads, knives, pins, and chains, while Assyrian soldiers now marched with iron swords, iron spear blades, iron helmets, and iron scales sewn into their tunics. The effect was immediate. In the year 743 BC, only 2 years after coming to the throne, King Tiglath-Pileser marched north against the kingdom of Urartu and conquered it easily. 2 years later, he marched west into Syria against the kingdom of Arpad. The people of the city of Arpad had fought the Assyrians before, and they knew what to do. They would simply close their gates and hold tight. The Assyrian army may have looked fearsome, but they knew that when the summer came to an end, they would have to go home and harvest their fields, just as they always had. But as autumn came, the people of Arpad must have realized that something was wrong. The Assyrians showed no sign of going home. In fact, it looked like they were settling in for a long stay. Tiglath-Pileser lay siege to the city of Arpad for 3 years, something that would have been impossible with the old seasonal armies. When the city finally fell, the Assyrian king ordered Arpad to be destroyed and its inhabitants slaughtered. It was a clear message to all those who stood in the empire's way that a new age was dawning. Much like superpowers today, the Assyrian Empire treated the areas outside its boundaries as zones of extraction, where life was cheap, and all that mattered was the empire's continued access to their resources. And Assyria would grow rich from the vast wealth it extracted from these areas. One text written during the reign of that cruel king Ashurnasirpal II lists all the wealth drawn from a single campaign of terror against the region of Bit Zamani.
I received harnessed chariots, equipment for troops and horses, 460 harness-trained horses, 2 talents of silver, 2 talents of gold, 100 talents of tin, 100 talents of bronze, 300 talents of iron, 3,000 bronze receptacles, bronze bowls, bronze containers, 1,000 linen garments with multicolored trim, dishes, chests, couches of ivory and decorated with gold, the treasure of his palace. Also 2,000 oxen, 5,000 sheep, his sister with her rich dowry, and the daughters of his nobles.
On top of this, 15,000 slaves were rounded up and brought back to Assyria to labor in manual jobs and provide a workforce for the empire. In campaign after campaign, Tiglath-Pileser conquered lands in Syria and marched all the way down the Mediterranean coast, taking coastal cities all the way to Egypt. He invaded the northern kingdom of Israel, destroyed their army, installed a puppet king, and deported large numbers of Hebrew tribes back to lands in Assyria. And Tiglath-Pileser also added one more remarkable new possession to the list of Assyrian conquests. That was the mighty and ancient capital of the south, the great city of Babylon. The city of Babylon had been the political and religious heart of southern Mesopotamia for more than 1,000 years. It was perhaps the most ancient and revered great city in the region, and at this time it ruled over an area known today as Babylonia. This is a landscape of marshes, covering much of the south of what is today Iraq, on the coast of the Persian Gulf. This was once the largest wetland in the Middle East, home to countless rare species of bird, and the reeds often grow so high that you can't see over them. Mesopotamia had once been divided between the Sumerians in the south and the Akkadians in the north. But this had now evolved to become Babylonians in the south and Assyrians in the north. And it's a cultural division that still exists today. In modern times, the distribution of the Sunni and Shia regions of modern Iraq roughly follow this same geographical divide. Babylon was the largest city in the world at several points in history, and it was perhaps the first city to ever reach a population above 200,000. Today, its awe-inspiring ruins sit about 85 kilometers south of Baghdad, a sprawling mass of crumbling walls. Its famous Ishtar Gate, with its ornate blue glazed tiles, its depictions of oxen, lions, and dragons, were at this time still several centuries in the future. But Babylon would have still been a resplendent city, glittering in the sun. And Tiglath-Pileser's conquest of Babylon shifted the balance of power in Mesopotamia. By the year 736 BC, the empire encompassed almost the whole of the region known as the Fertile Crescent. It now formed an unbroken corridor from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, linking up the trade routes of the Indian Ocean with those of North Africa and Europe. Its roads would have been thick with caravans of donkeys and camels, its rivers full of barges, carrying spices and precious stones, wheat, barley and fruit, gold and silver and brass. It was this empire, and the formidable army it now commanded, that the king Tiglath-Pileser III would pass down to his younger son, who would found the greatest dynasty of the Assyrian age. His name was Sargon II, named after that great ancient Sumerian hero. His dynasty would be known as the Sargonid Kings. They would rule for 3 generations that would form the highest point of the empire's achievements in war, art, and literature. But they would also be the twilight of its age. And when these 3 generations ended, the empire would finally collapse in ash and flame. At this point, I think it's worth pausing and asking, what was life like for the average citizen of the Assyrian Empire? Due to their officious record-keeping, we actually have a great deal of detail about how the people of ancient Mesopotamia lived. Like the Sumerians, the Assyrians wrote on clay tablets, which is lucky for us since it has made their texts incredibly durable. An enormous number of these pieces of writing have been recovered, so many that an estimated 90% have still never been looked at by a trained expert, and far less translated. The experience of reading these tablets is like hearing the babbling of countless voices speaking up to us from the impossibly distant past about a remarkable array of everyday matters. Just one out of countless examples is this letter from a child away at school, complaining to his mother that the other children have nicer clothes than he does.
Tell the Lady Zinu, her son, Idinsin, sends the following message. From year to year, the clothes of the young gentlemen here become better, but you let my clothes get worse from year to year. the son of Adad Idinam, whose father is only an assistant of my father, has 2 new sets of clothes, while you fuss even about a single set for me, in spite of the fact that you gave birth to me and his mother only adopted him. His mother loves him, while you do not love me.
As a result of this rich collection of texts, we can paint a remarkably clear picture of what life was like for these very ancient people. Walking the streets of a great Assyrian city during this time would have engaged every one of your senses. One such city was Nineveh, which would soon become the capital of the empire, the same city that the Greek writer Xenophon would one day pass by while fleeing from the Persian army pursuing him. Nineveh was an enormous city for the time. Its city walls were 12 kilometers long, built of a stone foundation surmounted by mud bricks, and enclosing an area of 7.5 square kilometers. The wall was broken by 15 gates, many of them named after gods, such as the Adad Gate, named after the god of storms, or the Shamash Gate, after the god of the sun, while others carried more descriptive names, like the Desert Gate, or the Gate of the Water Carriers. The city was surrounded by a moat filled with water from the river Tigris. The city would have been a kaleidoscope of rooftops, built in a largely unplanned manner, and its alleyways would have been covered with mats and reed awnings to keep off the heat, much as they still are in Iraq today. In the courtyards of houses, skins of wine and jars of water hang from the rafters to cool. We can imagine a joint of meat boiling in a clay pot on a fireplace, the smells of baking bread wafting from a clay charcoal oven nearby. The following recipe for lamb stew, translated from a clay tablet, shows the kinds of smells that would have been wafting through the city streets in the afternoon.
Stew of lamb. Meat is used. You prepare water. You add fat. You add fine grained salt, dried barley cakes, onion, shallot, and milk. You crush together and add leek and garlic.
Like the Sumerians before them, the Assyrians loved to drink beer. They drank it in groups, sipping it from large urns through hollow reed straws. Beer held a prominent place in Assyrian culture, and this inscription by the late king Ashurbanipal shows that even in the highest royal circles, it was considered among life's greatest pleasures.
In my reign there is prosperity. In my years there is abundance. My kingship is good as the choicest oil. Good beer I have placed in my palace.
Nineveh sat on the river Tigris and had a bustling dock and waterfront beside the gate known as the Dock Gate. This would have been a vibrant place, full of the smells of dried and fresh fish, stagnant water and mud, the babbling of the crowd, people arguing over prices and shouting greetings in dozens of languages. Merchants would sail downstream on barges or ships woven from reeds, perhaps travelling south to Ashur or Babylon, with clay urns full of beer or wine. The following letter contains instructions from a wine merchant to a friend.
Tell Ahuni, Balaam sends the following message. May the god Shamash keep you in good health. Make ready for me the myrtle and the sweet-smelling reeds I spoke to you about, as well as a boat for transporting wine. Buy and bring along with you 10 silver shekels worth of wine, and join me here in Babylon sometime tomorrow.
But the Tigris was a fast-flowing river, much faster than the Euphrates, and sailing back upstream was very difficult. So traders would often make the journey back by road, accompanied by caravans of donkeys. The road system was now much improved since the time of the Sumerians, and a sophisticated highway network now joined all of Assyria's major cities, with milestones at regular intervals, telling travellers how much further they had to go. But the roads were often dangerous, and although soldiers would patrol them, banditry was extremely common. One letter from a local governor shows his frustration with the lack of response to the bandit problem.
Tell Sin Idinam, Sili sends the following message. I have written to you repeatedly to bring here the criminal and all the robbers, but you have not brought them. And so fires started by the robbers are still raging and ravaging the countryside. I am holding you responsible for the crimes which are committed in the country.
In the cities, a great deal of life took place on the roofs of houses. During the day, women would gather on these roofs to perform the duties of maintaining their homes. They would pound grains into flour and knead the dough to make bread, prepare food, wash linen, and hang it out to dry. We can imagine them talking with their neighbours from roof to roof as they worked, and the sounds of their laughter drifting overhead. During the hottest hours of the day, with the Iraqi sun often reaching more than 40 degrees Celsius, or 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the heat would drive everyone indoors. The finer houses of the city often had a kind of cool room, with a floor made of polished alabaster or marble, and the walls painted with plaster. During the hottest parts of the day, the floor and walls would be splashed with water to cool the air inside. The city's poor would sleep on reed mats, while the rich had wooden bed frames with mattresses and coverings. The richest of the citizens had beds made of ivory and fine carved woods. And it's not just people that were thought to live in this city. The Assyrians believed that the world was populated by countless demons and spirits, who could not be seen or heard, but whose influence could constantly be felt, and who often manifested as bad smells. These demons were responsible for illnesses and disease, and they required the constant attention of exorcists to expel them. The following letter recounts the procedure for one exorcism for a person suffering from epilepsy.
As soon as something has afflicted him, the exorcist rises and hangs a mouse and a shoot of thorn bush on the vault of the patient's door. The exorcist dresses in a red garment and puts on a red cloak. He holds a raven on his right arm, a falcon on his left, and recites the incantation, "Truly, you are evil." After he has finished, he makes another exorcist go around the bed of the patient, followed by incense and a torch, and recites the incantation, "Begone, evil Hutubu," until the demon is driven out. He does this every morning and evening.
Talismans were often used to ward off these evil spirits, often small statues in bronze or clay, sometimes precious stones like jasper. They were often frightening images of demons, with the wings and heads of goats and dogs, and the tails of scorpions. And these would be kept in every corner of the house to ward off evil. As you walked the city, you would see these small talismans hanging from the rooftops. For many Assyrians, one crucial everyday object was what's called a cylinder seal. These were a small cylinder of stone, some no larger than a battery, which had complicated designs and symbols carved into them. The idea was that someone could prove their identity using this seal, and they could be used to sign contracts, just like a signature. People would wear them around their necks on a string, and when a contract was written on clay, they would roll the cylinder over it, so that their unique image was left printed on it. You could even seal a chest, an urn, or a door using clay or wax, and then print it with an official seal, so that everyone knew the last person to open it. The following letter of instruction to a member of the king's household shows the importance that these seals held in all manners of official business.
Tell Manaya that Siki Alani will be coming to you carrying the cylinder seals to reseal the entrance of the warehouse, and also the cylinder showing a Lamu monster for resealing the chests. Get everyone together, open the storehouse, and take as many as you can carry of the garments which are in the chests under my seal. Put your cylinder seal on whatever has been returned, and send me back the seal cylinders.
But these cylinders were expensive, and they signified that their holder was an important person of high class. Regular people had to get by without one, and to sign a contract, they would simply press their fingernails into the These ancient people's hands are still left on some of these documents. The people who lived these countless lives in the streets of the great Assyrian cities were probably largely unaware of what was going on in the vast grand palaces that loomed over their cities. They would have likely followed the comings and goings of kings with some interest, the way we might pay attention to celebrity gossip. But to them, the inner workings of the royal palace would have been as inaccessible and mysterious as the center of the earth. But what happened in those inner chambers would have an enormous effect on their lives. And as that final great dynasty of Assyria, the Sargonid kings, took to the throne, the dramas of the royal court would soon have deadly consequences for all those who called Assyria their home. The drama of the Sargonid kings truly begins with the son of Sargon, a man named Sennacherib. He came to the throne in the year 705 BC, and he would begin one of the most remarkable family dramas to come down to us from the ancient world. And he would be the father and the grandfather of the last two great kings of Assyria, Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. This great drama got off to a remarkably rocky start. Sennacherib's father, Sargon, had been a respected and feared king, but it's clear that something about Sennacherib meant that he didn't quite hold the same level of command. After only 2 years of his rule, several Assyrian vassals in the foothills to the east, in Syria and along the Mediterranean coast, all suddenly stopped paying their tribute to the empire. The Egyptians, always happy to throw sand in the eyes of the Assyrians, moved to back the rebels' fight for independence, and the young Sennacherib